Well, in March of 2020, Sri Lanka enforced one of the world's strictest China-esque COVID-19 lockdowns, despite one of the lowest death rates and infection rates in the world. And so for nearly 3 months, it literally crippled the economy and the livelihood of citizens there. But here's where it gets crazy. Then they actually go against global best practice and they ban the burial of COVID-19 victims, claiming that it could lead to groundwater contamination. I don't even know how they came up with this. But you know what this did was it significantly undermined the small minority of the country that is Muslim, because a religious practice there, is you bury your dead. And then that caused great pain to them. And then in turn, it hurt all these international relationships with all these Gulf nations. So then you come all the way around and then you go back to those same Gulf nations a few months later and you're like, can I have subsidized oil? And they're like, no, not so much.
And just to paint a picture of what's happening there right now, as I mentioned before, it's pretty much a state of emergency. You can see various videos trending on social media, and you always take those with some caution because sometimes people will take clips out of context or label them incorrectly or use clips from other moments in time. But what's really happening there right now, and you shared a video in our group chat, is everything is now being doled out in very small amounts. So there are lines for basic goods, and inflation is crippling there. And as Freeberg mentioned, they started to pin their exchange rate and their currency to, I guess, the world's exchange rate. And now everything is super expensive, and essential imports like food and medicine and fuel, they don't have the money to pay for it. So this is going to be a complete societal collapse, it seems, and they're going to need to get bailed out.
There was a bill that was introduced in the government that said the central bank would be forced to have a discipline on money printing. Sound familiar? In March of 2020, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka began printing money in order to finance a growing budget deficit. Again, happens in many countries. And they did that in part to fulfill an election promise that they made that they would maintain single-digit interest rates. Again, sounds really familiar. So they printed about 100 billion rupees in March. In the next 2 years, the central bank printed 1.65 trillion rupees, right? So 16 and a half times that first number. And then as a result, what they saw was the highest inflation in post-independence history. So time after time, what you're actually seeing in Sri Lanka is not a microcosm of something that's endemic to whatever you want to call it, Jason, a developing country, a third world country,
frontier,
a frontier country, a Southeast Asian country. In fact, it actually resembles many of the policies that exist in so many countries all around the world. And what's really important here is that as goes Sri Lanka, so goes Ghana, so goes Pakistan, so goes a whole bunch of countries where you're already starting to see food riots, food insecurity, energy insecurity, rampant inflation, sovereign defaults. And you have to ask yourself, like, how are we going to really tourniquet this whole thing and prevent a much bigger contagion like Freeberg just talked about? I think it's a
and we might be
really
out of bullets,
important issue.
Because you mentioned COVID. It turns out a lot of these frontier countries were already on debt relief and being given a moratorium on making their debt payments since they got so walloped during COVID. And then now the other shoe drops, and here we are. There's no relief you can give them if they're already not paying their loans in some cases.
By the way, here's another thing that happens in a lot of these developing countries. So in the middle of all of this chaos, what do you think happened? The parliament got together, they passed an amendment to the constitution, and it enforced and it gave incremental power to one individual, the president. And typically in most of these countries that run by a parliamentary system, the president is a figurehead, right? The person shows up, shakes hand, kisses babies, that's it, right? Maybe convenes a Senate, but that is it. Now, all of a sudden, the person has control over defense, control over budget, control over the central bank. And this person cannot be, voted out in a no confidence vote the same way that a prime minister can. That happened here as well. So yet another example of if you start to see a bunch of autocrats in some of these developing markets feel like the answer is more power, it's been tried here, it didn't work. So I think that there's a lot of lessons. I am a little concerned and skeptical that many of these other developing countries that are teetering on insolvency will actually learn.